Hello. We're joined today by several members of the group whose story we've been following through Building Together, a 3-part episode series by Vancity, profiling the story of a group of friends who came together, bought property together on the Sunshine Coast, and are now turning that land into a community for themselves with homes, gardens, and so much more. Well, let's get started. So first and foremost, I want to address the babies in the room. It looks like you guys have added a couple members to your team since we last checked in. Can we get some intros?
Yeah, this is Orson. He's been a huge joy brought to our lives, and he's proven
He's
it
excited
right there.
to be introduced.
Excited
it's my
to be
time
here.
in the limelight.
Yeah, and among such great friends acting as aunts and uncles for him. Great community to be growing up in.
And then who do we have here?
Oh, this little squawker is Finch.
Hey, Finch.
Yeah, he joined us in October, and he's a joy. He's trying to keep up with his big brother Rufus over there.
I love it.
Yeah.
Both so adorable. Maybe to begin, I was curious, you've shared your story now on the internet. What happens when you put things on the internet is you get a lot of feedback. I'm very used to some comments on my own videos, not always nice, but I was kind of curious if you've heard any sort of reactions or kind of feedback to your story. What have you heard?
I found it pretty funny. I just started getting text messages and messages from random folks that I hadn't heard from in a little while, like old coworkers and stuff like that. One person was like, "I see you," and I looked around and was like, "What do you mean by that?" And then there was an Instagram campaign that reached a lot of people. And so people were seeing this and then just reaching out. A lot of people that were doing maybe similar things in Vancouver or looking at co-buying houses, they reached out and asked for a bunch of advice as to what to do, legal frameworks, who to interact with at Vancity, that kind of thing. So it was cool, kind of brought people out of the woodwork, and there was a lot of interest.
I was thinking you guys are the co-ownership influencers.
Hopefully we get it right then.
Oh, yeah, no pressure, yeah. Anyone else kind of hear any sort of thoughts or feedback?
Yeah, I heard from people in different countries too. That was pretty cool.
That's wild.
Holland, New Zealand, Australia. So yeah, word definitely got out pretty far. And then also just walking down the street, one of my neighbors was like, "I saw you online." So yeah, it was cool to be able to share the story. I feel like for a long time we haven't had an easy way to tell this story, and so people were finding out about it, and also we were able to share it with people who already knew about it but didn't know the details, and that was really awesome.
That's fantastic. It sounds like it's really served as a way to inspire people who maybe don't know about this concept, but also really motivate people who are kind of maybe in the middle of their own journey of co-ownership and seeing your story and seeing that it's possible. And I don't want to forget, I finally want to ask Colleen, I don't know if you've heard any feedback on your end.
I think there's a lot of interest in the community in finding ways to sort out affordable housing in the city and how to stay connected with your community at this kind of transition period in life when you're trying to figure out, is it possible to stay here? Is it possible to age in place in Vancouver, or do we need to start looking outside of the city? And what does that mean for connecting with our community? Definitely interest with folks at my work. I posted, I think Annalise originally posted it on LinkedIn, and then I reshared her post. And there was certainly questions that came up at work meetings, and people wanted me to send them all of the links as soon as the videos were released. So definitely an appetite to learn more about this project and to find ways to stay connected to community as we age.
Oh, fantastic. Well, sounds like you've got some fans already. Well, what I'll say is, at least from Vancity's perspective, the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. You guys have no haters on the internet, which is quite the accomplishment.
Not true.
That's what we'll say anyways. But and a lot of the response has been a lot of people just curious, as you've mentioned, curious about how to do something like this. How did the co-ownership work? How did you guys meet? What's the sort of context here? And so I wanted to really get into that sort of story a bit today is, how did you guys get together? And before we kind of get into, the deep dive on that, I thought we could cue up a clip from the episode, around your guys' story.
We've been friends for a long time.
A lot of us met through Engineers Without Borders while we were attending university.
What drew me to this group was a sense of openness, enthusiasm for life.
Ultimately, it led us to living together and really being witnesses to each other's lives as we went through all these different chapters. And along the way, on many of the group trips, we had conversations about this desire to find a way to keep this community together.
Right. So you guys all met through a shared love of engineering, I'm assuming. But at what point did you guys, start like really considering living together and actually going in on a property?
I think maybe the tough real estate market in Vancouver sort of played a factor in preventing us from purchasing houses earlier as well. Put us in that position where we were all renting still.
Right. Yeah, so there was also some financial necessity to kind of come up with an innovative solution for housing yourselves long term.
So when we had that initial call referenced in the other video, all of us were still renting. We're all thinking about purchasing a house or some property at some point in our lives and not sure how to make that happen in the current Vancouver market.
Let's get into the technicalities of this then. I don't know if any of you guys are lawyers here, or I don't know how, I'm sure you've learned so much about the co-mortgage, but I was kind of curious, like how does co-ownership work? Does anyone want to take a chance at trying to explain this whole thing?
Well, I think we should start at the beginning there. And when we bought the property, one of the conditions we placed on it was that we jointly form a joint venture agreement to try and work out as many of these questions beforehand as possible. And we had a good 2 or 3 meetings where we just sat in each other's houses and hashed through this list of questions our lawyers had sent us, like if one of us wants to leave, how are we going to do that? How would we make decisions together? The voting system we alluded to.
If a couple separates, that was another part.
Yeah.
If somebody
dies.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Every hard question we could come up with at that time.
Before we even bought the property,
I see. So on that note, can I get a sense of what would happen if one of you, for whatever reason, had to leave the partnership? What would that process look like? What would you do with their land?
So I was actually talking to someone recently about this. And so if someone wanted to leave the joint venture, if their circumstance kind of demanded it or they decided to, we actually put together in our joint venture framework a process where the land gets assessed. We take a look at the market value. We get outside third-party assessments to make sure it's impartial. We get 2 assessments, make sure they agree. If they don't, we get a third one. And then we go through, and then the group itself has first right of refusal. So they can choose to buy the property from that person or absorb the share amongst whoever in the group is considering it. And if that doesn't happen, then it goes out to market. And I think the idea there was essentially that it's fair for the people that are in the property and in the joint venture. It's also fair for the person that's leaving, because we wanted to make sure that people aren't penalized for having life circumstance happen.
That really clarifies things. Now I'm going to backtrack a little bit here, but I think it'll be to the benefit of our viewers to kind of what this joint venture is. What does that look like? How do shares in this, thing work? Does it come down to like how much of the land you get?
When we were figuring out the original framework of the joint venture agreement, we were always keeping in mind the end goal, which is that every family group, whatever that looks like, an individual or couple, gets a lot. One property at the end of the day. So if you frame all your decisions like that, then that actually means somebody who came in like as a single actually has like 1/7 share, 1/7 vote. And then we had several people who came in as couples who share their 1/7 vote. So Kane and I are a couple. We have, for example, half as much power in the agreement as Andrew, who came in as a single. And the idea is that in the end, Andrew will have 1 lot, and so will we. And so we wanted that to be equal all the way through till the final vision.
I see. So the properties themselves, the lots themselves are equally divided.
Yes.
But it's just sort of the ownership of that is diluted in some cases for couples. And in some cases.
Yeah, well, and when we're talking about like a share or like voting rights, it's how much money do we have to put into everything.
Right.
And so we would, a couple will put in the same amount as a single. and also how much influence you have on decisions. So it's relative to how much money we put in, basically.
Oh,
But we tried to make it, I don't know if that wasn't very clear, but basically it's all about trying to make it so that we all have an equal property at the end of the day, and we've all put in equal amounts to get to that property.
yeah.
That's the objective.
No, totally. No, I think that made sense to me. Now, one sort of anecdote that I heard while watching your guys' videos was that some banks that shall not be named today laughed you out of the room. Do you have a sense, or what was that experience like? Why do you think it was just such a out there idea for some of these institutions?
I think a lot of institutions, like banks, like many other companies, see challenge as a risk, and therefore steer away from it if possible.
Right.
Fear of the unknown?
Fear of the unknown, yeah.
Right.
And it seems like banks and insurance brokers are very risk averse.
Very risk averse. Yeah.
You don't say. Yeah. And if I remember correctly, this quote was from you, Colleen. And so I was kind of very curious for your specific perspective on this. What do you think about this?
Most of the conversations that I had with banks were, I guess the first reaction was, so how are you related to one another, and what legal framework exists between the group? How are you going to make decisions? Sorry, you want a mortgage with 10 people on it? How is that going to work? Most of the bank's reactions were, you don't fit into the box and framework that we've established, and we're unwilling to change that framework to accommodate something different. And the reaction that I got from Vancity when I walked into the bank was, I'm not sure that we've done that before, but that's not a good enough reason to not try and figure this out.
Yeah, shout out to Vancity for that one.
Yeah, Vancity's been amazing at just getting creative about how to make this work. Like, we don't have a form with 10 signature spots. Let's make one.
We make a new form.
Yeah, so that's been amazing that they've adapted and pivoted with us along the way to make it work.
That's fantastic.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of other banks are very risk averse, and they saw that number as a risk because, as we talked about, what happens if one person wants to leave? Does that just blow up the whole project? But I think we see, and Vancity was able to see, that 10 partners can create a more resilient investment for the bank and for us, in the sense that we can pool our financial ability. And technically speaking, we are all actually, each of us is liable for the full amount of the mortgage. So that feels to me like a very safe bet for Vancity.
Right.
And I think they were able to see the resiliency of the group.
Right. So there's 10 people that are on the hook, basically, if something goes wrong.
Yeah, and we can support each other. If someone for a little bit of time was unable to make their payments or something, we can kind of fill in and help them temporarily.
And I remember when we were first going through and looking at what kind of mortgage we qualified for, it's like, okay, 10 working professionals, what kind of buying power do you have? And there's a lot of income within the group that, when you think about that as a pooled bit of income, and yeah, we're buying a property that's a reasonable price for all of us.
Right. There's a lot of financial power when you kind of pool your resources together.
Yeah, I think someone at Vancity early on there, when they were evaluating this, told us that each of us individually would probably qualify for the mortgage. So it does sound pretty low risk.
Oh, yeah.
From their perspective. I guess I wanted to add also that our agreement it's not a corporation that we formed. It's just a partnership of individuals, and that's what the joint venture is. So it establishes this voting structure and share ownership. But I think that also was a bit scary for banks to look at, right? They feel more comfortable if it were a corporation.
Right. If it's an incorporated entity,
Yeah, or same thing if we were related to each other, they're more comfortable with married couples or parents and children potentially owning together.
Right. There's still some notions of what traditional kind of family structures look like.
Yeah, so I think that was just a bit unusual for other
Right.
banks to be looking at.
Right. How could these people possibly be together if they're not making money together and a business, you know, like.
I think Vancity's willingness to acknowledge that there are different ways that families are created, and a willingness to acknowledge that families don't necessarily need to be legally bound to one another in the traditional senses of family, and expand that definition to include chosen family and community.
So let's get to the fun stuff, the rezoning application. Hope I'm not bringing some, bad flashbacks there for you. But, I think, you left us with a real cliffhanger with these episodes. You have to subdivide this property, and to do that, you had to go through the municipal government to do so. And maybe just as a refresher to our audience, can we show a clip of that real quickly?
As it turns out, the renovations were a piece of cake compared to the subdivision and rezoning process.
I think the renos were fairly straightforward. The rest of it is a lot more complex, right? You start from, we want to subdivide the property, to, okay, how do we actually accomplish that, and who do we need to talk to? We assumed that we would be able to just take this property, which is 4 acres, and carve it up into 8 half-acre parcels. Once we embarked on rezoning and subdivision, sort of this next stage, in conversation with the planners, we realized pretty quickly that that probably wasn't going to be achievable, or it just wasn't going to work. So that's a big shift. That was a big shift in terms of, okay, great, we're just going to carve up the property, everyone gets their own piece of land, build a house, build a driveway, to, okay, how are we going to make this work?
Can you give us an update on how that's all going?
Yeah, I'd just say quickly that the rezoning was one of the first stages where we actually had to change the zoning for the property. So before, we wouldn't have been able to build all of these homes on it. We had to change what we could do with the property, but now
create the new zoning type.
They even came up with the
There's a new zoning
type.
Yeah.
Wow, we're making new rules here.
Totally.
Yeah.
And we were successful in that. We engaged with the community in that. That was really great to get their input as part of the process. And then now we're on the subdivision part of the journey still. And I know Colleen would be a great person to touch on this, but of course we've all got lots to say about it.
Oh, I'm sure. Well, with that, Colleen, do you mind chiming in on this rezoning process?
Yeah, so the very first steps were for us to navigate the rezoning that Annalise and Kane already spoke to. And then at the same time, we had to update the official community plan to add this new zoning area to it. So it was both of those things in parallel with one another, the OCP amendment and the rezoning application. So that was kind of the first hurdle. And then the next step after that was basically we needed to get organized for a development permit application to basically prove to the municipal government and the other regulatory agencies that we are mindful of stormwater management and aquifer protection, recognizing the critical water crisis that exists on the Sunshine Coast. And then additionally to that, we needed to go through the process of the subdivision. And that has multiple different elements that relate to it. But primarily, they want us to show that we have considered the archaeological elements on the property, should there be any artifacts or anything that are found, any culturally modified trees, and basically show that that there isn't any concern about that. We need to look at what are the arboricultural elements, so what trees exist on the property, how we're going to maintain those. We need to look at soil conditions, and in this case, we are managing our wastewater treatment on the property, which is one of the major constraints that Lauren speaks to in that video, is that we can't just divide the property into 8 parcels because we need to be able to treat our wastewater on site, and that really drives the size of the lots available to us. So we go through that process, and that's what we're navigating right now, and there's a bunch of legal frameworks that exist to be able to subdivide a property, but we're in the home stretch on that one right now.
I want to move on to sort of the sustainability piece of your guys' project. And before we get into talking about that, I thought maybe we could show a quick clip.
So in developing this project and trying to do it in a sustainable or low impact way, we were really mindful of how water moves on the land, how animals move on the land.
How we've done a lot of the renovations, most of the stuff we got from the restore, which is not new fixtures, not new flooring. For myself, one of the biggest drivers to be able to own is to be able to put in things like solar so that hopefully the home I build will be a net generator of electricity rather than a consumer.
What made you prioritize the things you did, like reusing water on site or the solar panels? And are there other kind of sustainable solutions you're considering as part of this project?
Reusing building materials, putting in the manpower and effort to get building materials from an unusable state into a finished state is something we've been putting a lot of thought and effort into in this project. Reusing old flooring that's torn out of a wrecker house and planing it down, sanding it, staining it, and using it as flooring, as trim, as door frames, and alternate uses of discarded materials has been a big motivator for us, I think.
That's like a reduction of waste. You're decreasing the, impact, carbon impact of doing different building projects by being able to reuse those things. I think Tess's folks are a good model for that. They built their place on the Sunshine Coast and collected lots of different materials in order to try and minimize the impact that they were having. Being a renter in Vancouver, you have some longer term payback things that you can do for sustainability, and those are really hard to do when you're moving, every X number of years. You can't really pack up all the solar panels on your roof and take them with you to the next place you're renting. And so there's a few things that I've wanted to do long term to kind of reduce my impact that just aren't possible with that renting model. And so I think this was extremely exciting because it was oh great, a place that there'll be ownership of and there's some stability there. So you can actually put some of that stuff in and make some of those longer term decisions rather than just what's good for short term always.
I want to shift gears into kind of why Gibsons made sense for your group. And before we get into that, there was a kind of a comment that Kane made in the video that I thought we could quickly refer to.
The housing market for both purchase and rent in Vancouver is a little bit bonkers. It's maybe it's a lot bonkers.
Easy as that. I think the elephant in the room always with any discussion on housing and property is just the astonishing price of real estate in Vancouver and our region. And I'm sure that must have played no small part in moving out to a place like Gibsons. How much of this do you think was a result of the housing situation in our region right now? And do you think something like this could ever be viable in Vancouver itself?
It is absolutely viable in Vancouver. We have heard lots of stories of people doing something similar. Not a group of 10, but groups of 6 or 8 for sure. My funniest personal anecdote there is when we were in the hospital, fewer than 24 hours after I'd given birth to Rufus, the wonderful nurse who was tending to us in our room, we got chatting with her, and I don't remember how it came up, but basically I learned that she was doing the exact same thing that we were doing, but in Vancouver. So she and 2 other couples had bought a home in East Van and were renovating it and creating 3 different units so that they could live, and they were different generations too, so I think that they did that really well. And they came at it with different financial situations. And since I heard that story, I've heard the very similar ones elsewhere, and they're not the same group. So I know there are other people doing this in the city. You're not going to find 4 acres in the city of Vancouver. So it's going to look different, maybe multiple units in one house. But it's absolutely possible to do this, and I think it's that much more important in these really inaccessible housing markets.
I mean, I would be a little bit devil's advocate and just say, the house I'm currently living in, 3 levels, just sold for $2.1 million. And I had a flash of a moment, me, my husband, and my baby live there. We don't want to move. Could we buy this in addition to doing this project? And immediately crunch the numbers. It's absolutely not. It would compromise this project and this commitment to this initiative, but B, just financially, it's a tough market to be in. So I do think that we got in at a good time. Not to say, of course, everybody always says buy real estate 10 years ago, but we did get in at a good time, and prices have risen a lot on the Sunshine Coast as well. So that's impacting our project in some ways, but not catastrophically.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, fantastic that you were able to get in earlier.
I think it's worth people to kind of look into the option, though. If they're looking to buy, maybe see if you can pool your resources with other people. And there's a lot of houses in Vancouver that have multiple units, and you might be surprised at what you can afford if you pool your resources.
I think like there's the classic model that a lot of people have heard of is like you'll buy a house and you'll rent out portions of it to help with the mortgage. But kind of it seems like you could have a win-win situation here where if you just go in on a house with your friends that you already love and enjoy spending time with, and hopefully have a good history of like living together and conflict resolution and all that, you could really end up with a just sort of like I said, a win-win situation. So that's really cool to hear. And I guess like my last question, other than how can I join this crew, my last question is like what are the sort of the next steps for this project in your minds?
Each of us takes on projects and supports those projects through to completion, and we are all contributing to them, which makes this possible. Like teamwork makes the dream work. In terms of the next steps for the subdivision, we've received our preliminary basically layout review from the different agencies that are part of the project. So we have a group that is responsible for managing the water and wastewater, the group that's responsible for making sure that connectivity to the greater transportation network, and then a group that is just reviewing our engineering design. So we received the preliminary layout review in December of last year. So that basically gives a list of criteria that this group needs to meet in order to get our subdivision approved. So it's truly like a checklist of here's all the things that we need to see from you to be able to move forward. So we are in the process of getting all of those documents together to support that ask from the different municipal agencies. And then as soon as all of those things are put together and we resubmit, fingers crossed, we have achieved all of the objectives on that checklist and we're able to move forward with subdivision. So we have basically finished the engineering design for the water, wastewater, transportation, electrical, all of those pieces. And now we are just waiting for the final couple of pieces to fall into place for submitting our applications and getting all of the legal framework sorted out with registering the lots and registering the subdivision. And then we can hopefully next spring, we're in a position where we can start to actually move some soil around.
Very exciting. We're at the finish line.
One finish line and starting the next.
Very true. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yes.
Some next steps that we're working on right now are also figuring out what our bylaws are going to look like. Once we actually form a strata, we need to submit bylaws to form it. So we've been kind of going through the standard bylaws and making some changes to those to kind of suit the group better. We're also trying to figure out where all the money is going to be coming from to do the actual construction for the improvements on the property to subdivide it. Yeah, so just small things like that.
Yeah. No big deal. Once you figure out the whole infrastructure of like how like sewage and all that's going to work, the condo bylaws seem a bit more manageable.
They do.
Yeah, and like while we're talking about costs of housing, like two of those like costs of borrowing is one of those challenges that we're now approaching. And that's a large factor in
to finance the construction.
To finance the construction, and then also the cost of construction is quite high right now as well. So we're about to see two of those big hurdles coming up that we'll need to navigate.
It sounds like to me we need to do a reunion soon afterwards. Those were all the questions I had on my end. Thank you so much again for spending time with me to talk about your really interesting story. I think we'll all keep following very intently on what's to come. And for those watching right now, if you haven't seen the videos already, check them out, Building Together on YouTube or wherever videos are shared. They're really, really interesting stories. And stay tuned because there will be more updates. Thanks again.
Thanks,
you too.
Yeah, thanks. It's a real pleasure. Yeah, this was fun.